This is the Bruchim podcast, the only podcast in the world dedicated to Jews who think differently about circumcision. Welcome back to the Bruchim podcast. I'm your host, Eli Sargon, and joining me today from New Haven, Connecticut is our Director of Education at Bruchim, Max Duboff. Max, how's it going this morning?
Yeah, it's going well. Happy to be here as always.
Yeah, so today we're doing something really special. As we delve into some of these interesting topics, one of the things that we always want to keep in mind is that all of these practices that we talk about on the podcast are things that people have lived experiences with, right, Max?
Yeah, definitely. And especially with hatafat brit, there's some awareness in our broader culture of what it is and how it works, but really not all that much. And so one thing we really want to do is highlight some real life accounts of how hatafat brit works, what sorts of situations it's performed in, and, kind of what it's like for folks to experience it and to approach it.
Absolutely. And how people feel about it, I think, very importantly,
Definitely. Right. How people feel about it is so important. And this is something that I think, as you were alluding to, Ellie, really complements our kinds of more theoretical discussions because, how this practice really plays out in actuality puts all kinds of constraints on what we're kind of thinking about at a more theoretical level with phrase practices. That's true for circumcision and for hatafat brit, and really for any practice that is common out there in the world. And also, we get, all sorts of really important information for more theoretical discussions, but also there's so much value in sharing stories, in listening to people's stories when it comes to these kinds of practices that we talk about on our podcast and really beyond as well.
And to that end, joining us today from Stockholm, Sweden is Tim Kynerd. Tim, welcome to the Bruchim podcast. It's a delight to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So, Tim, I was wondering if we could start off with your giving us the background of how you ended up experiencing hatafat brit. This is a practice that you underwent. But before we get to the actual experience of it, tell us, what were the circumstances that led to your getting hatafat brit?
Sure. Basically, the short version is just to say that I converted to Judaism about 10 years ago. And it was during the period leading up to my Beit Din and Mikvah that I had hatafat brit as part of the process. If you don't mind, I'm going to tell a funny story and try to keep it brief. When I had my first conversation about conversion with my sponsoring rabbi, we had lunch together. And then she had picked me up from work because I had taken public transit to work. And she picked me up, we went to lunch, and then she dropped me back off. And I was about to go into a meeting, and she called me, and she said, "There's something I forgot to ask you, and all you have to say is yes or no." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "Are you circumcised?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Okay, that makes things a lot easier." But basically, she and I talked about many, many different issues in the period, when I was studying with her and learning about Judaism and everything. And this is one of the things that she brought up. And she told me that she didn't require it, but that I could do it if I chose to. And so I did choose to, because I guess I was looking for, I was interested in things that would make me feel more that I was adhering to the Jewish people, if that makes sense. And this was something that I thought, this is something kind of concrete and physical that I can do that is a way of identifying with the Jewish people.
Yeah, and I'd love to get a bit more into that sort of ritual aspect and marking this transition as part of conversion. Can you tell us a bit more, though, about the background of the rabbi and the congregation you were affiliated with? Just to, again, because you said this was considered optional.
Yeah, I was a member of Congregation Beit Mishpacha in Washington, D.C. at this time. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that congregation. Beit Mishpacha is the LGBTQ congregation in Washington. My sponsoring rabbi at the time was the rabbi of that congregation, and that congregation is not affiliated with any denomination. So the congregation per se does not really have opinions about these kinds of ritual things. They have opinions about ritual matters in the synagogue, of course, but not, other things. And as for my rabbi, she's Reform trained, and she would have required me to be circumcised if I had not already been. I don't think all Reform rabbis require that necessarily, but I'm pretty sure that she would have, because that's why she asked me the question, right, on the phone in that incident. Yeah, but she and I basically had a conversation about hatafat brit, and I thought about it a little bit. And as I say, I just decided that it was something that I wanted to do. So, yeah.
Before we get to the actual decision, I'm wondering if the fact that it was optional as opposed to mandatory made a difference in the way you felt about it.
I'm thinking about that. I'm not sure how I would have felt if it had been mandatory. What I might say is I might have found it less meaningful if it had been mandatory, if I had not been able to make the decision myself. I would not have had a problem with doing it if it had been mandatory, but I think it would have carried less meaning for me. Yeah. So
I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the meaning that the practice took on for you. You were alluding to it earlier that this was something that was deeply meaningful to you. I'm getting the sense of. So can you talk a little bit more in detail about like the actual content of the meaning that it had for you?
I will try. I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say. I tend to be a little bit not very wordy, but I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say other than the fact that I liked the idea of being able to do something that was actually physical in my body that would connect me to the Jewish people, since circumcision was not an option. I knew a guy when I lived in Brooklyn. I mean, I'm still friends with him on Facebook and everything, who went through an Orthodox conversion and had brit milah as part of that, and we were both members of a kind of an independent minyan in Brooklyn. And he had a sort of bar mitzvah where he learned from the Torah for the first time and everything. And he gave a Dvar Torah, and he actually talked a lot about his circumcision and what it meant to him during his Dvar Torah. It was very interesting. But since I didn't really have that option, so I was glad, I was glad to be able to do something that was meaningful to me. And like I said, that was physical in my body, not just, going to the mikveh was very meaningful, but it isn't the same as, I kind of want to say having something done to you, you know what I mean? But having something kind of a mark on your body rather than just being in a mikveh and being cleansed, so to speak.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And do you think that the role of blood relates to that sort of physicality that you felt more with hatafat brit than with mikveh?
I'm honestly going to say no to that personally. And the reason is that I grew up Southern Baptist, and Southern Baptists tend to be obsessed with blood as a sacrifice, Jesus' blood as a sacrificial element. And I've honestly, ever since I was a child, been repulsed by that. So I don't think it was the blood in and of itself. It was more just the idea that this was something physical and bodily is the word I really want. Yeah. So.
Could you recount the actual day and the procedure and what you were thinking, what you were experiencing, what you were feeling, how it happened?
Sure. I'll tell you a little bit about the kind of the preparations that led up to this. My rabbi helped me find somebody who could do this. There were actually a couple of rabbis involved. My rabbi, who was our congregation's rabbi, and also our congregation's rabbi emeritus, were kind of involved in finding somebody for me and everything. The person that my rabbi found, who actually didn't charge for this, was a pediatrician animal in Rockville, Maryland, I believe he was. I had a friend who went with me. This is something else I'll get to in a moment. There's a reason I'm mentioning this. I would describe my friend as orthoprax. I'm not sure he's orthodox, but he's very traditional in his approach to Jewish practice and everything. So he went with me. And the day I went, I had to take public transportation way out into the suburbs and find, take a bus and everything to where this pediatrician fellow had his offices. And my friend went with me, and we got there. And I mean, I was a little bit nervous because I'm not a big fan of physical pain, and I wasn't sure how painful this was going to be. But I was also kind of looking forward to it as a ritual, just, for the ritual value of it. And one thing that was interesting was this gentleman, this pediatrician who did the procedure, he had kind of I don't want to say casual, but a not very intense attitude toward the proceedings, shall we say. He explained to me what he was going to do, and that was that was good. I'll get to that in a minute. But before he actually started the procedure, one thing my friend said was, are you going to make a brucha, before this? And the pediatrician's reply was, I'm not planning to make a brucha. You can make a brucha if you want. That sort of typifies sort of the attitude I was getting from him. But anyway, what he told me and what he did basically is he said, as best I can recall, like I say, this was about 10 years ago, I use a very, very, very fine gauge needle. And he said, I'm just looking to get one drop of blood from your penis. And he said, I'm going to be going into a part of your penis that is basically where your circumcision would have been done, when it was done, or if you still had a foreskin, And he said, the thing I thought was a little bit threatening was he said, this is a very fine gauge needle. So he said, I don't always get a drop of blood on the first try. And I was like, oh, I'm really only looking to do this one time. Please, please, please. But anyway, so basically, I took down my pants and laid down on a, what do you call it in a doctor's office?
Exam table?
Yeah, that's the term. Thank you. Good gracious. Laid down on the exam table. And basically, he performed the procedure. And what I will say about it is that it was intensely painful for a fraction of a second. And that's all. And he did get a drop of blood on the first try. Thank goodness. But yeah, it was fairly kind of, straightforward, and maybe businesslike is a good word for the attitude from the pediatrician Moyle that was performing the procedure. But anyway, yeah, so I think his attitude did kind of detract a little bit from the ritual quality of the actual procedure for me. So that was a bit of a shame. But, I wasn't, I was mainly concerned about it being painful. So I don't know how much difference that actually made. But anyway.
And you said the pain was momentary, so it really was not something that lasted long.
No, I've always said, reflecting on it, I've always said, this is not something I'd do again for fun, but it's not something I would hesitate to do again if there was a reason for it. It wasn't like horrifying or anything, it was very, very painful for just a fraction of a second, and that's all. And then it was over, so.
In the sort of immediate aftermath, how did hatafat brit sort of figure into your thought process around the conversion? I mean, I know you mentioned it was quite meaningful. So did it seem meaningful in the sort of short term, or is it more reflecting on it in the longer term, or both?
I think it felt more meaningful then when I was kind of on the way to conversion, on my conversion journey. Than it did afterwards. Although when I think about it, basically, I don't know that I would necessarily say that it feels really meaningful. But when I think about it, it is something that I'm glad that I did, if that makes sense.
One of the areas that we talk a lot about on this podcast are the ethics of these procedures and the lines that we may draw around them, around things like consent and, that sort of thing. I'm wondering if you have any feelings that you'd like to share about the ethics of hatafat brit or circumcision and brit milah in general, and whether you think of them differently when it applies to adults versus children or infants and this sort of thing.
Well, I'll say this. Hatafat brit, as far as I know, is mostly chosen, right? It's mostly elective. So I don't have the same ethical problems with that honestly I do with brit milah to an extent, because if I step outside Judaism for a minute and I say, is it ethical to perform a medical procedure on somebody without their consent that isn't medically necessary? And I think that answer pretty much has to be no. That doesn't feel really ethical. At the same time, I'm very aware that behind anti-circumcision movements in many places, there's a lot of anti-Jewish feeling. So that's very obviously very problematic, and it makes me kind of reflect on, maybe ethics, unfortunately, are not, I hate to say it, but not the only consideration, because I do see value in upholding Jewish traditions. I mean, this is one of the reasons I converted. This is a major reason why, where I am now, I help lead services for my congregation because, I want to uphold those traditions and rituals and everything, right? But yeah, so I'm a little bit torn about that between the ethics and the need to uphold the tradition. It's kind of tough. I have a friend who I've talked about this with, and when I told him how I felt about the ethical aspect, he was very shocked. He's born Jewish, and he has told me that he's had lots of arguments with people online about brit milah, and I'm sure that in most cases those people were coming from a very anti-Jewish place. The people he was arguing with, so I understand how he feels about that, but yeah, I do still have this kind of ethical thing going on where I'm just not fully comfortable with it if I step outside my Jewish frame and consider it that way.
Totally. Yeah. No, I mean, and I think also part of what your story really helps to bring out is how powerful it can be to connect to Jewish tradition. And hatafat brit, it sounds like, was one of the ways that you were really able to do that in the conversion process and
Exactly.
beyond, which is
Yes.
great. And I mean, and one thing that, Ellie and I are thinking about and talking about a lot is the ways that we should try to think about a lot of Jewish practices from within, right? And Bruchim is a Jewish organization, but also like trying to really engage with practices that we have conflicted feelings about from a place of like, this does matter, in an important
Exactly.
sense, as something
Yes.
that has been, historically practiced by and afforded a prominent place in our tradition and by our people. And it's really tough. It's really tough to balance all kinds of things. And certainly, as you note, there are lots of folks who are not coming from that sort of perspective. And they're the sorts of things that they say are often not respectful.
Tim, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Is there anything else that you'd like our audience to know about your experience with hatafat brit or your general thoughts on the subject?
I don't think so. I mean, I would just encourage anybody who is converting, and I mean, this gets into a little bit of deep waters, but anybody who is converting and has a penis to consider doing it. I mean, for trans people, it can be a little bit more fraught, and it can also be a little bit more difficult for their rabbis to address. There are a lot of issues there that can be a bit tough. But I would say, anybody who has a penis, I think should at least think about it. If they're already circumcised, obviously, it's definitely worth at least considering, engaging with, thinking about, because it can carry a great deal of meaning in terms of coming closer to the Jewish people. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Tim. Really a pleasure to chat with you about this. And thank you for sharing your story.
Thanks. No problem. Enjoyed it.
And joining us today from Oakland, California is our special guest, Jason Welle. Jason, welcome to the Bruchim podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me. And it's Jason Welle, just for the record. Rhymes with belly.
Jason Welle, thank you for the correction. I should have asked in
Yeah,
advance.
no problem.
So let's jump right into it. Jason, tell us a little bit about the circumstances that led to you first learning about this practice of hatafat brit, and like, what did you think about it when someone told you about it?
I think long before I seriously considered conversion, I had read something about what it would take to convert, like what are the sort of requirements. And along the way, I learned that at some point, some streams of Judaism might ask you to do a symbolic circumcision, and that it would involve basically piercing your penis with a needle. And of course, I was horrified by the idea. I thought, that's it. I'm not going to do it then. Between that and pork sausage, I would never consider this. And so I think that was probably my first reaction to it. I imagined like a big sewing needle being thrust into the head of your penis. And yeah, that obviously sounds like a pretty horrible experience. So it was probably some time after that I revisited the possibility of conversion and started learning more about it and what it really was.
So apparently this was not enough to keep you away from the Jewish people.
Well, then I learned that not all streams necessarily require that. And I thought, oh, well, maybe we can consider this.
So when you did finally decide to go through with the conversion, tell us about that, and which denomination, and who was the rabbi, and like how did it go?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the hardest things when you're considering converting is, and you don't have, like, I didn't convert for marriage, for example. So I didn't have a particular connection that I was converting through. So I think for someone like me, one of the more challenging things is just understanding the different ways that Judaism is practiced in the United States, especially because that's my context, right? And there's different streams of Judaism and how they differ and what does that mean. So I found initially it was kind of hard to just get that information. Like, what are the differences? I grew up, my best friend growing up was Jewish. So I'd been to his bar mitzvah, his sister's bar mitzvah. And so I had experienced a little bit of Reform Judaism. But beyond that, I didn't really have much experience or knowledge. I finally came across a YouTube channel by a rabbi who had a show called the Jewcurious podcast. It was kind of a podcast and YouTube channel. And he was himself a convert and was ordained in the conservative stream of Judaism, I believe through AJU in Los Angeles. And he finally had a YouTube, one of his episodes was kind of his effort to try to explain some of the differences and what do they mean and how do they practice Judaism differently. So I think then at some point I started actually maybe checking out different synagogues. Where I was living, we had a Reform synagogue, a very small conservative synagogue, and then a Chabad. I kind of felt like in the beginning that Orthodox was not really going to be open to me for a number of reasons. So I was more exploring conservative and Reform. And I just found that when I attended the conservative services, I found them more enriching. I love the people at the Reform synagogue, but I connected with the services at the conservative synagogue more. And then I started talking to the rabbi and we hit it off. We became friends. We still are. We had a lot of similarities and common history. And so I started working with him as my sponsoring rabbi. And then with conservative Judaism, circumcision and hatafat brit are considered the norm. There might have been a way for me to go through and not do it, would be with another rabbi or another beit din. But I came to understand that if this was something I was serious about, then hatafat brit was going to be a part of it. And I sort of like at that point felt like, well, I feel like this is where I want to go. Like this is the path I want to follow. So I need to really think about whether this is going to be a line that I'm willing to cross.
How did the rabbi bring it up?
He basically just talked about it being emphasizing that it's very painless. It's a very small needle. It's only a speck of blood. It's not like, going to the Red Cross and donating where they're going to take a pint. Right? It's very painless. And I was like, okay, I'm going to trust you on this.
Okay, so he set your mind at ease that this wasn't going to be a sewing needle through the head of your penis.
I mean, he put my mind more at ease than when I first learned about it. Let's say that. Because let's be honest, right? It's a sensitive part of a man's body, right? It's a sensitive part of your body, socially, culturally, and physically. It's sensitive.
Talk about the day and give us as much detail as you can about the experience.
Right. And so then I wasn't sure. I guess I still wondered, like, does this mean, like, is a rabbi or someone going to handle me? Is he going to handle my penis and do it himself? What does that mean? So what I actually came to, when I scheduled my beit din, I decided to do it with one that's organized by the Rabbinical Assembly, which is sort of one of the conservative sort of organizing organizations for rabbis, right? I did it, my beit din and mikveh were going to be at the community mikveh at American Jewish University. They have a couple of different beit dins that you can schedule with. So I scheduled with the Rabbinical Authority, partly because as my process of conversion went on, I really came to value the traditions of Judaism and wanted my conversion and my practice to move. Maybe if it wasn't immediately traditional, I wanted it to be formed and going in the direction of traditional Jewish practice. So I did it with the Rabbinical Assembly beit din. And when I made the appointment, she said, you have a choice now. You can do your hatafat brit ahead of time, and we can help you find a moil who's probably a urologist in your area, or you can do it with the rabbi after the beit din or at some point during the day. And I chose the latter just to make it frankly easier to just do it all on the same day. So that was something that was interesting to me, that I could find a local moil who was probably a urologist, which, to be honest, kind of put me at ease, because if if I'm going to have someone handling me, I'd like it to be someone who's, been doing this for a while and is comfortable with it on their own part. So a doctor doing that to me was another level that made me feel like, okay, that feels more comfortable to me. So I scheduled it on the day of. So I had my bait in, wonderful experience, nervous in the first 5 minutes, and then all the nervousness went away. And we just had a wonderful conversation about my journey, my desires, how I see my Judaism, how I live out my Judaism now, how I hope to live my Judaism. And then the next step was the hatafat brit. So the way we did it was a private room with me and the rabbi. And I actually stood behind a barrier with the rabbi just outside. And it wasn't a needle so much as it was the kind of lancet that a diabetic would use. I don't know if you've ever seen those, but they are tiny. They are beyond tiny. So and this is something I want people to hear, that if they're thinking about this and they are curious about the needle, it's not a sewing needle and it's not in the head of the penis. It's a diabetic lancet. They're spring loaded. They are literally painless, and it needs to be on the shaft of the penis where the scar of because like most American men my age, I was circumcised as a baby. So that it's done right at that sort of, and you can see it when there's a coloration change where the circumcision took place. So that's where you do it. The funny part is that it took me 3 tries. So the first time, and of course I was nervous about this, right? I was nervous because I'm about to lance my penis. So the first time the lancet malfunctioned. So it didn't spring out at all. So I had to stop and go out and say, it broke. I need to do another one. And he was so great. He was very calm. He's like, okay, no problem. He has a whole box of lancets there. Go ahead, just take another one. We'll try again. So I went back behind, and I was thinking that I would feel it. So what I had to do is, do the lancet and then put the cotton there to get the droplet of blood to show the rabbi. So I thought, well, I'd be able to feel it, and then I'd know where to put the cotton, and then I could take it to the rabbi. So I wasn't really, I was kind of hoping that would be the process for me to do. Well, I didn't feel it at all. Like, there was literally no sensation. So I wish someone had told me that earlier too. Like, I felt nothing. So I didn't know exactly where to put the cotton. So there was nothing on the cotton. So I had to say, sorry, I did it wrong, and I've got to do it a third time. And this time I was just much more, I figured out a way to do it, get the cotton there, get the speck of blood, show it to the rabbi. And he said, all set. And that was it. So 3 times a charm.
And the third time it wasn't painful?
It was not painful. I just figured out a better way to get the spot where I did it. And it was really a speck. It was a very little amount of blood. It wasn't anything where I had to put a Band-Aid on. I didn't have to put pressure on it. As when you get blood drawn at the doctor, they ask you to put pressure on your arm. None of that. It was just barely a speck of blood even came out.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the significance of this for you as a convert. Did you feel like I imagine that for some people it's sort of like crossing a T or dotting an I, not to put too fine a point on it, but for other people it's deeply,
so to speak, no pun intended.
Exactly. But for some people it's actually deeply religiously significant. I'm wondering if what was the meaning behind it for you in terms of your experience, and did that change over time?
Going into it, it was definitely just part of the process. This is what I had agreed to do to become Jewish, so I was doing that. But then when it was done, he looked at me and he said, this is the covenant. This is the way that you become part of the covenant, the same covenant of Abraham and our ancestors for generations upon generations. And all of a sudden, that became a very moving moment for me. I hadn't even thought of it. I mean, of course, I know, I've studied. I know that's, that was what that covenant was, circumcise yourself and your children, right? But then to do that and have that moment where I was so nervous and had to do it 3 times, and I was like, oh, thank God I got it done. But then the rabbi says, but now you're part of the covenant. This is it. Maybe you're not totally Jewish yet, but now you're part of the covenant. And that was then it became a really beautiful, meaningful moment for me that I had not expected at all. To know that I was in that moment now connected with this broader community that goes for generation upon generations, right? Yeah, very, very meaningful for me.
Do you think part of the meaningfulness was based on having performed the hatafat brit yourself? And would you choose to do it yourself again? Or would you choose to maybe have a urologist do it or someone else?
That's a great question. I think for some I don't know this, but I think for some traditions, you need to have a moil who might just be a rabbi do it. I think maybe in more Orthodox streams, you would have it done to you instead of self-administering it.
There's questions about witnesses and what exact practices
Exactly,
are
right.
about how
Yeah,
witnessing works.
right.
So that's part of the issue.
Right. I think feeling about it like I do now, I would be okay going back in time and doing that way. I think I still would have been nervous in the lead up to it, but it was just those few words of saying, now you're part of the covenant, were incredibly powerful to me that I hadn't expected at all. So yeah, in retrospect, I'm okay with the way I did it. It was fine. Probably wouldn't have taken 3 times if Moyle had done it for me. But yeah, no, I think I'd be okay with that being done by a rabbi who's a Moyle or a urologist who's a Moyle.
I have a peculiar question for you. Was there any part of you that wished it could have been a circumcision as opposed to a hatafat brit?
No. So, I mean, like I said, like most American men, especially my age, I was circumcised as a baby. I've never questioned that. It's just always been how I am. It's never bothered me. It's never challenged my view of ethics. It's always been part of how I'm built. But I know people who've done it as adults, usually for medical reasons. A friend of mine who was in my conversion class did it for medical reasons, but he was also in conversion, so kind of worked out for him, right? That just sounds painful. That sounds way more painful than even a knitting needle to the head. Right. So I'm glad I did it this way. It was a beautiful, meaningful experience. It had the symbolism, at least for me, that I hope that it's meant to have as a symbolic circumcision. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's so great to hear about what the rabbi said to you afterward, and and how the sort of welcoming you into the covenant explicitly was so meaningful. And I mean, I think that's a feature of a lot of stories of hatafat brit that I've heard, that also just like how it's done, and sort of also the communication that's going on, and also the sort of affirmation that there can really make such a difference to not only how it goes in the moment, but also how it's remembered afterward. And it sounds like you really have remembered this positively, despite the nervousness beforehand.
I think beforehand, the other thing I just thought of is that they were okay with doing Beit Din, hatafat brit, and then mikveh. And I was really worried that am I going to be still bleeding? Because then you can't do the mikveh, right? So I was a little worried about that as well. But then I understood at the end, there's literally a speck of blood, and then it's done and you're fine.
One other thing I wanted to ask, just following up on some of where we started, is there any information about hatafat brit or related topics that would have been really helpful to you to see as you were beginning your conversion journey? Because of course it's so common now for so many folks who end up becoming Jews to read various things on the internet and internet resources, and sort of how we're talking about a lot of these practices are so important.
I think just the practicalities of it. I would have liked to have known that I would have liked a rabbi to have given me a diabetic lancet and said, this is what we're going to use to see how tiny it is, and to say it's not going to go on your head. It's going to go at this point on the shaft. And I've never heard anyone complain about pain. Maybe that's not true. Maybe some people are really more. I mean, I don't know. But I think I would have just liked that more specific information about what it was going to be, instead of letting my imagination run wild.
Yeah, no, totally. That makes sense. And we're so appreciative that you're willing to share your story and help, provide some of those accounts that can give folks an idea really of what it's like in detail.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jason Welle, thank you so much for being a guest on the Bruchim podcast. We really appreciate your openness and frankness with us.
I appreciate the invitation. I'm glad I could be here to talk with you about it.
And joining us from the Pacific Northwest is our special guest today, Yoshi Goodman. Yoshi, thank you so much for coming on the Bruchim podcast.
It's a joy to be here.
So, Yoshi, talk to us a little bit about how you found yourself in the circumstance of making decisions about hatafat brit.
So, my mother is a convert. She converted in the 70s when she was in college. And the rabbi that she converted through, he was not known for keeping the best records. This was back in the days of everything was paper records in boxes in his garage kind of thing. And in the early 2000s, my sister made Aliyah to Israel. And they had to get confirmation of my mom's conversion. But there had been an accident, and a lot of the records that rabbi kept were destroyed. There was a fire in his house.
Oh, gosh, wow.
So they decided to do the conversion to remove all doubt, because obviously my sister and I had both been raised Jewish our entire lives and everything, but they wanted to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, as it were, before she made Aliyah. So I had to have a hatafat brit as part of my conversion to remove all doubt. And actually, fun fact about that, the rabbi who did my hatafat brit was the same rabbi who did my circumcision.
So your sister was making Aliyah. You were not making Aliyah, right?
Yes.
So why did you need the hatafat brit? What was the reasoning behind that?
If I ever wanted to make Aliyah, it was better to just get everything out of the way now. As long as we were going through all of this stuff for my sister, it made sense for me to do it as well.
Okay, I see. So, and this was the impulse to do it was coming from you. This was something you wanted.
Yeah, I wanted to affirm my Judaism, and I thought, I've been raised in this religion my whole life. I don't want there to be any question of it.
Yeah, totally. And so how was the topic raised? Was it something, building on what you were just saying, that kind of the whole family was talking about together, or was it something where you sort of took individual initiative to want to really remove this kind of doubt with this Gior L'Chumra? Yeah, how did that go down?
It was definitely something that the entire family talked about. The impetus was coming from my sister, who was making Aliyah, and she was the one trying to explain to us all of the complicated legal hoops that she had to jump through to make Aliyah. But once it was explained to me that this was an option, I said, yeah, sure, I'm willing to go through with this.
Just to get a sense, how traditional was the sort of community or the rabbi under whose auspices you were going through this process of conversion to removed doubt?
He was Orthodox.
Yeah, so definitely a case where, the sort of presiding rabbi didn't seem to see any halachic issues with sort of like considering folks really part of the Jewish community already, and truly, as you were saying, this sort of formalization process.
Yeah, I had my hatafat brit in California, which is where I'm originally from. And then I had to go before a Beit Din in New England because it's a specific Beit Din that was preferred by the Israeli government.
And did they make you go through, like, other than the hatafat brit and meeting with the Beit Din, was there like further process? Like, was there study? Was there the turning you away and all that business? Or was it kind of like a fast track?
No, they asked me about my upbringing, my bar mitzvah, which I was 16 at the time this all happened, so it wasn't really that long ago that I had gone through it. They wanted to know questions about my Jewish education, things like that, but it was a pretty simple process for me.
That's really good to hear. Certainly, even in cases where it's a sort of formalization process where there is technically conversion involved, certainly Orthodox practices I know can be very Byzantine and confusing. So definitely really glad to hear that wasn't the case for you.
Yeah, tell us, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about the actual event, like how you found the person to do it and like what it was like.
The hatafat brit was actually performed by, as I mentioned, the same rabbi who did my circumcision. And he mentioned at the time that it was the first time he'd ever had occasion to recheck his handiwork. And he was an Orthodox rabbi, and all of the rabbis involved in this process were Orthodox rabbis. I was raised conservative because my father's family was reform, but my mother wanted to be Orthodox, and so they kind of compromised on raising the children conservative. But everything was done in this process to Orthodox standards for my sister, who is now also Orthodox.
Was it done in a hospital room, in like an outpatient
No.
setting?
It was done in a synagogue, in one of the, I believe it was one of the school rooms that they used. Obviously, there was no one in the room other than us.
So they didn't have witnesses. It was you and the mohel.
They had witnesses, but the Moyle and I were turned away for privacy reasons. But then once he did the prick, he showed them a cotton ball with a single drop of blood on it.
And what was the experience like for you? Was it like, again, was this a technicality for you from like a psychological and spiritual perspective, or was it more significant than that?
I think at the time I viewed it as a technicality, but as I got older, I viewed it as being much more significant because it really helped me to reaffirm my place within the Jewish community. At the time, I just thought of it as jumping through hoops to help my sister out with something. But as the years went by and I really got to think more about it, and as I met and spoke to more people who had been through formal conversions, it deepened my sense of how significant the event was. I think part of it was the willingness to go through the process, because the actual process itself was relatively painless. The needle that they used, I have diabetics in my family who do the finger prick test, and the needle that they use is thinner than one of those. There was literally only a single drop of blood. So the actual prick itself, I felt basically nothing, but the entire process of feeling so vulnerable was deeply moving as a way of affirming, like, I am willing to go through this process in order to be part of this people that I love, and I'm claiming my space.
And it sounds like there was a good communication in the process about what would be involved with hatafat brit and in general with the gir l'chumra. Is that correct? Is that your experience?
Yes. My mother, in addition to being a convert, she was also a cantor in the conservative movement. So she had a lot of experience in Jewish education. So the entire process, she was very clear and open about exactly what was going to be happening, what would be expected of me. There weren't a lot of surprises.
That's really good to hear.
That's
Yeah,
very good to hear.
One thing that Ellie and I have been discussing is just, the ways that communication and transparency can make such a difference in all sorts of, domains when it comes to circumcision, hatafat brit, etc. And so that's really good to hear that in your case, things did go well in that regard.
You may or may not be surprised to hear this, but you're very lucky in a lot of ways in this story. I've heard so, I mean, even in just like this little unit that we're preparing for this season of the podcast, but like just in general in life, like I have heard horror stories about people in situations that are not dissimilar from yours.
My fiance is also a convert, and hearing their stories about what they had to go through in order to convert, and the other converts that they have known and stories that they have been told, it really can be frightening.
I think I share Max's relief to hear that things went well for everybody in this situation.
Totally agreed. Yeah. Oh, are there any other aspects of hatafat brit or this experience just kind of formalizing your Jewish status that really stand out to you, years later?
I think that the process of going to the mikveh was also extremely affirming for me. That the sense of emerging from the waters and it being a completion of sorts, that like it is official, that there's no questions anymore, like this is who I am, this is my status.
That's a really cool thing to be able to, to really remove doubt and to take the step of sort of extra recommitting oneself to Judaism and to a Jewish life, and especially, I'm sure, it's so helpful to have the support of family while doing that.
Yeah.
That's a really good thing.
Yoshi, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and sharing your story with us. We really appreciate it.
Anytime.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Next time on the Bruchim podcast.
Our son was about 8 when we moved there. The girls were 4. And to be bar mitzvah, the rabbi insisted on the hatafat brit. So our son asked us not to. And, I consulted with the bet din, and they asked an odd question about it. Why is he self-conscious? And they said, is he particularly fat? And I said, no. Odd question, I thought, but, what causes somebody to be uncomfortable in these situations? Not thinking that, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old is going to want grown men touching him there. But it was insisted that to do his bar mitzvah, that had to be.
And this was over the objections of your son was presented with this information that in order to be part of the community, to be bar mitzvahed in the community, he would have to have this procedure done, and it was explained to him, and he was not into it.
Right, correct.
I was not aware of this happening at the time, having been very young,
Yeah.
but he has told me since then that he begged for months to not have to do that.
Thank you for listening to the Bruchim podcast. If you like what you've heard here, please help us sign up more Jewish communities to our Mark D. Rees Inclusion Directory. To apply, simply head on over to our website, bruchim.online, and under the What We Do tab, click on the Inclusion Directory, and then click on Sign Up Now. Lehitraot.